History, like life, is to a large extent an inscrutable and overwhelmingly complex mess, the succession of so many events. Many of them anomalous, fortuitous, arbitrary and random, others interconnecting, building upon and reacting to each other. But it's a natural and perhaps psychologically necessary phenomenon for us to impose some kind of retrospective order on it all, to give meaning to it, to construct and impose, or to uncover and reveal, depending upon your viewpoints, the grand narratives, the stories that underpin and make sense of it all. But to do so, it seems we need to view history from the perspective of epochs, ages, periods, civilizations. It seems like we need to divide and classify the wealth of human experience across time, space, and peoples. That kind of division, especially chronological division, necessitates the identification of markers, of reference points. We could discuss all day whether such markers are mere arbitrary labels of convenience, whether they oversimplify and obscure the real issues, or indeed whether they genuinely reflect the tides of history in a more fundamental way. The tides of history, that's a cliche if anything. A metaphor, of course, one based on the presumption that history is somehow subject to scientific forces much like gravity. But it does seem that we need these concepts of periods and dividers to make sense, or to make a sense of it all. So what markers do we use? The answer to that is obvious enough. Centuries, the reigns of kings and queens, presidential terms, and indeed wars. Some wars mark the turning point of history, the death of one age, the birth of another. Some wars are catalysts. We tell ourselves that they directly ushered in a new era, whether that be through the exhaustion of a combatant nation's wealth or resources, by revealing the corruption and moral bankruptcy of a ruling faction, thus opening up opportunities for others to step in and dominate the political and commercial stage. Now, the cliché goes that the victors write history, but sometimes the notional victor is left so spent by the experience that the task falls to others, leaping in to fill the vacuum left in the wake of the de facto mutual destruction of combatants through a war. Conversely, some wars are less transformative, but rather they typify an age or civilization. They define or are defined by a society's culture. They demonstrate the mores and arts of an age. Now, looking back to the 20th century, the examples are so obvious that it would be too trite to mention them. And as for our present century, it's all too relevant and raw. And I'm not going to get into contemporary politics and current affairs here. So when we think of the Greek classical era, by which I mean the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, the golden age of Athens, if you like, I dare say that most people would think primarily of two or perhaps three major conflicts. First, the Persian Wars, the campaign led by Darius in around 490 BC, culminating with the Battle of Marathon, and then by his son Xerxes 10 years later. Those campaigns traditionally mark the commencement of the classical period, its history, culture, and architectures, most literally insofar as the greatest monuments of the Athenian Acropolis were built upon the ruins and ashes left by Xerxes' army. We might also consider the Peloponnesian War between Athens, Sparta, and their respective allies, which stretched across nearly 3 decades, as the era's defining, scarring war. And we might say that the campaigns of Philip II and of his son Alexander the Great marked the end of the classical period and ushered in the Hellenistic age. But I also look to another war, one taking place several hundred years earlier, as sowing the seeds or setting the stage for what would eventually evolve into the civilization of classical Greece. A war fought primarily upon the Lelantine plain in Evia or Euboea between Chalkis and Eretria and their respective allies, probably in the late 8th or early 7th century BCE. We don't even know for sure which side won, if indeed there was a victor. Looking back on it, perhaps both sides were left devastated, the title of victor being an empty, meaningless label, which is perhaps precisely why the ancient historians do not care to tell us who won. It seems, you see, that before the war, Euboea was at the heart of what was shaking up to be a revolution in trade and culture. And it could have been celebrated as the birthplace, the epicenter of the classical golden age. But that's not how the story goes. Rather, Athens, not even 100 kilometers away, and Corinth are usually remembered in the popular imagination as the leading commercial and cultural powers of the Archaic and Classical periods. Euboea had become a relative backwater, but it so nearly wasn't so. Welcome to Ancient Classics. Evia, or Euboea, is the second largest island of the modern Hellenic Republic after Crete, just north of Attica, east of Thebes. Chalkis, or modern-day Halkida, and Eretria are near neighbours, and between them lies the Lelantine plain. You can drive from Chalkis to Eretria across the plain in about 15 to 20 minutes. They're that close. Today, Chalkis is, I think, by far the largest town on the island, but in the 8th century it seems it and Eretria were more evenly matched. As the two dominant settlements in the region, they were therefore natural rivals. Two rival towns so close, separated by a fertile plain, they were perhaps destined to clash, and while I don't know for sure, I wouldn't be surprised if there had been a long history of conflict between the two, and that's notwithstanding claims made by the likes of Strabo nearly a millennium later that the two settlements generally got along fine, which perhaps they did when times were good. Whatever its immediate causes, the Lelantine War of the later 8th century or early 7th seems to have been of an unprecedented scale and significance, drawing in allies from across the Greek-speaking world to fight on either side, or at least that was how it was presented by subsequent generations. But we'll come back to that in the next video. But in this video I want to discuss the significance of the two combatants, and indeed the plain upon and over which they fought. Let's take a step back and look at the grand scheme of history, the rise and falls of civilizations. It's a familiar story. Now, I'm making no pretense to historical accuracy here, to modern orthodoxies. Much of what I have to say is considered folksy and romanticized, even cheesy and outdated, but who cares? This isn't an academic paper, it's a YouTube video, goddammit. In the late Bronze Age, around the mid to late 2nd millennium BCE, mainland Greece hosted the so-called Mycenaean Palace civilization, a culture whose principal archaeological sites are found at Pylos, Tiryns, and of course Mycenae. The culture spread across Greece and had links over the Mediterranean with Egypt and with the great cultures of the Near and Middle East. It was a literate culture, at least insofar as writing was used in the palace administrations, though there is no evidence, so far as I'm aware, of writing having any everyday, let alone literary applications. Then came the famous Bronze Age collapse, a series of political and cultural shocks of disputed origins and effects, but which nonetheless shook the wider region. The most popular English language account in recent years is, I guess, Eric Klein's 1177 BC, the year civilization collapse, which gives you an idea of the rough date we're talking about, though neither Klein nor anyone else claims that the events, whatever they were, all played out within a single year. See how important arbitrary or quasi-arbitrary markers are to us. In Klein's words, without question, the interconnected world that had existed for centuries came to an end, especially in terms of loss of coherence of society and socio-political complexity. Some groups not only experienced a diminished social structure, but for all intents and purposes actually vanished. For instance, the Mycenaean and Minoan civilizations essentially disappeared. It would seem that the collapse of the palace networks had a profound impact on culture and trade across Greece, and on its interconnections with the wider world, so much so that Greece was plunged into what is sometimes still called a Dark Age, one that lasted, depending on where you draw the line, until the 8th, 7th, or even 6th centuries BCE. Now, it's uncool to talk of Dark Ages. It has been for well over a quarter of a century. Sorry. But to me, the starkest evidence of the collapse of the Mycenaean palace society is the loss of writing, a 500-odd year break in evidence of written Greek. Moreover, what's also so significant to me is that writing in the 12th century BCE, whilst confined to the palace administrations, was not just some local idiosyncrasy. We see the same text, Linear B, being used in different palace sites, from one end of the Peloponnese to the other, namely Mycenaean Pylos, and indeed in Crete. Moreover, though that text, that which we call Linear B, bears no resemblance whatsoever to later scripts, let alone the modern Greek alphabet, the language of the text was undoubtedly Greek. An early form of Greek for sure, but still clearly the same language as that in which the classical authors of the 5th century BCE wrote and which our friends from the Hellenic Republic still speak today. As far as I'm aware, there's absolutely no evidence of writing being used in Greek from the 11th century BCE through to the 8th, so if one defines a Dark Age as being one without surviving literary evidence, well then the Greek Dark Ages merit that title, no matter what people might say. But as I say, the term Dark Age is deeply unfashionable, and one's not supposed to use it. And it's fair enough to say that we shouldn't judge a period or culture solely on the presence of a literary record. There are many, indeed, who claim that Greece in the period from 1200 to 700 BC was anything but dark. They'll point, if not to written texts, then at least to the archaeological record, to settlements with their own rich cultures and evidence of trade with peoples from far across the seas. True, but like where? Well, one of the key sites from which so much rich evidence of culture and continuity throughout the Dark Age derives is at a place called Lefkandi or Xeropolis. And where's that? By the coast on the Lelantine plain itself. Here we have evidence of more or less continual occupation from the Bronze Age through to a much later period, a rich and always developing culture, one bearing the evidence of imported goods from across the Aegean and further afield. Indeed, it's been said by some that Lefkandi is the precursor to Eretria or perhaps Chalkis, but that the settlement had to move a few kilometres one way or the other down the coast, perhaps as a consequence of the Lelantine War itself. But back to writing. I noted the absence of writing in Greek, at least, from the 12th century onwards. But in or around the 8th century, or perhaps earlier, evidence of writing, this time in what we know today as the Greek alphabet, re-emerges. How and where from? Certainly not from the old Linear B traditions. There seems to have been a complete break in the written tradition. Rather, the conventional view is that the Greek script was adopted and adapted from another culture, specifically the Phoenicians. That's a commonplace going back as far as Herodotus, and presumably earlier still. As Herodotus writes, these Phoenicians, who arrived with Cadmus, brought into Greece the alphabet, which had until that time been unknown to the Greeks, and presently, as time went on, the sound and the form of the letters were changed. At this time, the Greeks that dwelt around there were for the most part Ionians, who, having been taught the letters by the Phoenicians, used them with some few changes of form, and in so doing gave to these characters, as indeed was just, seeing that the Phoenicians had brought them into Greece, the name Phoenician. So Herodotus attributes the adoption of the Phoenician alphabet largely to the Thebans and Ionians, but he's referring to Cadmus for God's sake. So the reasonably prevalent modern view, which is disputed but which never quite goes away, was that it was the Euboeans who introduced, or at least played a significant role in the alphabet's adoption and subsequent promulgation. Indeed, some of the oldest surviving examples of written Greek in the modern script come, if not from Euboea itself, then from sites associated with Euboean traders and settlers. It's kind of funny that some of the earliest examples of Greek script come from the more westerly stretches of the Greek world, like the famous so-called Cup of Nestor, found at Ischia just off Naples. But those sites were predominantly Euboean colonies or commercial hubs. And indeed, that's the whole point. The Euboeans were especially active at this time towards both the east and west. So it should be of no great surprise to learn that a technology, writing, adopted from Euboea's trading partners in the east should make its way to the archaeological records of their western domains. And indeed, the adoption of writing is just one facet of this wider phenomenon, the activity of the Euboeans as traders, colonizers, and agents of cultural transmission and innovation. For it seems that the Euboeans played an important and perhaps the leading role in Greek international commerce and then colonialization in the west, east, and even north as far as Thrace. It's a role that is reasonably well attested in the written record, albeit through folk memories and ancestries preserved by the likes of Herodotus many generations later. But from the mid-20th century, archaeological evidence of the full extent of Euboean ventures began really to stack up, as Professor Anthony Snodgrass writes. The Euboeans are the great discovery of early Greek archaeology since World War II. Long before that time, the insistent appearance of the Euboeans in the literary record of early colonization had pointed to either a gap or a failure of recognition on the archaeological side, but the 1950s were the watershed for archaeology. The Euboeans could be shown to have been the first Greeks to open the sea lanes of the eastern and central Mediterranean as mariners, and in most opinions as traders. But at a certain point, these rules were exchanged for that of leading the way in permanent colonizing settlement. And thus we have evidence of Euboean settlement, referred to in the ancient literary record but corroborated from more recently uncovered archaeological finds from Italy up to as far as north as Macedonia and Thrace and eastwards. Perhaps most significantly, it seems that there is a strong Euboean presence, or at least an influence, in an international entrepot in the Neo-Assyrian Empire itself, at a place known today as Almina, at the mouth of the river Orontes just north of modern-day Syria. Almina, it seems, was never colonized by the Euboeans, and they may have had only a tentative presence there, but that's significant in itself. That they had even made their presence felt within the Assyrian Empire, notwithstanding or perhaps because of the fact that those areas could not be colonized, being under centralized Assyrian control. Thus the Euboeans may have proved an essential vector of culture and ideas between the emerging civilizations of Greece and the most powerful empires of the East, without necessarily relying on the intermediation by the likes of the Phoenicians. In fact, so significant was the role of Euboea as an intermediary between far-off lands, empires, and the Greek mainland, that the Euboeans are even name-checked by Alcinous himself, the king of the mystic, otherworldly Phaeacians in Homer's Odyssey. In Book 7 of the Odyssey, Odysseus has spent 10 years stuck in the mythical world of goddesses, nymphs, and monsters. He's even visited the underworld, though he hasn't, at this point in the Odyssey, had the opportunity to tell his tale. He's now washed up on the island of the Phaeacians, Scheria, in a liminal place between the world of gods, monsters, and myth, and the real world, a society that superficially bears the trappings of the epic literary palace civilizations, but with magic ships and stuff. Though he is not yet aware of Odysseus' true identity, King Alcinous is impressed by his guest and promises to arrange safe passage for Odysseus back home, wherever that might be. Alcinous says of his sailors, "They shall row you over the calm sea until you come to your country and your house, or to whatever place you will, even if it is much further off than Euboea," which those of our people who saw it when they carried fair-haired Rhadamanthus to visit Tithys, the son of the earth, say is the farthest of lands. So Alcinous, this king from a mystical island, knows of Euboea, albeit that it is at the very edges of his people's knowledge. Bear in mind that the Homeric poems tell of a time of legend, but one which loosely corresponds to or distantly recalls the pre-collapse Bronze Age civilization. And also bear in mind that by the 8th century, the Homeric epic tradition would have been in its advanced or mature form, perhaps not too different from that which was written down and transmitted to us. So how telling it is that Euboea should be singled out in this way, the one named reference point in this promised voyage from the world of myth to the world of men, of civilization. I think it's fair to say this by way of a summary so far. Whether one calls it a dark age or not, there clearly was some kind of major economic and social disruption in the 12th century BCE, and it would not be until the 8th to 6th centuries that Greece became a significant cultural and commercial centre in its own right. But it seems that Euboea, or Evia, and the area around Chalkis, Eretria, and the Lelantine plain were one of the areas that were perhaps somewhat less benighted than their neighbours throughout the Dark Age, and moreover, towards the end of the 8th century, the Euboeans were right at the vanguard of the developments that would eventually lead to the innovations of the Archaic and Classical periods, establishing ancient Greek civilization as one of the preeminent cultures in world history. Then the Lelantine War happened. Next time we'll look at our ancient textual sources for the war, such as they are, and consider its causes. Meantime, like and subscribe and we'll be back soon.